Immigrants from Mexico, Central America, and South America have been coming to Oregon since the mid-19th century. Early immigrants came in the mid-1800s to search for Oregon gold and serve in the volunteer militia during the Indian Wars in southern Oregon. In the late 19th century, Mexican vaqueros played a major role in the development of Oregon's livestock economy. One immigrant family, the Maria Carvajales, ran a small lumber company out of Rockwood in the early 1900s. The majority of immigrants in Oregon came between the years 1942 and 1947 as part of the Bracero program, also known as the Mexican Farm Labor Program. The program, which ran from 1942 to 1964, was an arrangement between the United States and Mexico that allowed the United States to recruit Hispanic workers to fill labor shortages created by World War II. Newspaper ads were run in Mexico to recruit laborers to work on railroads or farms throughout the United States. The majority of braceros worked in California, but around 15,000 bracero workers labored in Oregon. In Oregon, workers harvested hops in the Willamette Valley, apples in the Yakima Valley, potatoes in Klamath County, and sugar beets in eastern Oregon and Idaho. Most braceros were young, able-bodied men accustomed to labor and capable of hard work. The work they performed was hard, and injuries were common due to the use of implements such as the short-handled hoe, which required workers to stoop for hours. Language barriers were another common source of injury. Workers were only allowed to return to Mexico in the case of an emergency and required written permission from their employer, or at the end of their contract when they were required to turn in their permits and leave the country. Hispanic immigrants were scarce in the Pacific Northwest prior to the Bracero program. Following the war, the government stopped subsidizing the travel of workers, and many of the workers in Oregon dropped out of the program. But the Bracero program had encouraged Oregon agriculture to rely on Mexican labor, and once the flow of workers was cut with the termination of the program, Oregon farmers turned to migratory labor. This spurred the development of Latino communities in Oregon. During the 1950s, many Hispanic immigrants settled in Hood River, Woodburn, Independence, St. Paul, and eastern Oregon, and switched from farm labor to cannery work, railroad work, construction, or work as seasonal harvesters. By the 1960s, many of the immigrant families were able to purchase homes, and their children, many of whom were speaking English as their first language, attended public schools. Some of these families opened their own local businesses, including small stores and restaurants. A second influx of Latin American immigrants came to the Portland area in the 1970s. But it wasn't until the 1980s, after the passing of the Immigration Reform Act and the Special Agricultural Workers Program, that many of the immigrant families began to settle in the Gresham area. Through these programs, workers were able to send for their families and settled as permanent residents. Many of these families formed communities built around relatives and neighbors who shared a common place of origin, a language, and shared traditions. One early Hispanic Gresham resident was a man by the name of Frank Escobar. He resided in Gresham at the beginning of the 20th century and was a well-known and much-liked town eccentric. He was a close friend of the Short family and tended Dr. Short's horses. He also installed a water tank in the attic of the Shorts' home, connecting pipes down to the kitchen that provided the family with the first running water in town. Frank lived in a small house on First Street just off of the corner of Main Avenue, which had no indoor bathroom. Lifelong Gresham residents recall that Frank Escobar had the most beautiful roses in the whole town. A small cemetery named for Mr. Escobar is located on Walters Road between the Pioneer Cemetery and the Springwater Corridor. Ironically, Mr. Escobar is not buried in the cemetery which bears his name. As of 2010, Hispanic residents made up around 18% of the Gresham population. While only around one-fifth of the total population, we see many examples of how various aspects of Latin American culture have become deeply ingrained in our way of life. Mexican-influenced cuisine has become widely popular in Oregon, and in Gresham we have several Mexican restaurants, markets, and bakeries. Additionally, various Latin American festivals and traditions, such as Cinco de Mayo and Dia de los Muertos, are now celebrated, with large festivals occurring in Portland. Perhaps most importantly, Gresham and other Oregon cities have become increasingly bilingual, with Spanish as the most common second language. Public libraries now carry books written in Spanish, Spanish language programs are offered, TriMet signs are written and read in Spanish, and bilingual employees are increasingly common in local businesses. Adoptions and changes like these are a few ways that we see the various cultures of Gresham melding together to form a community.